My phone buzzed at 1:47 in the morning, and I knew before I even looked at the screen that it was my mother. Because she's never once in her life waited for a decent hour to say something urgent. Tomorrow night, dinner with your sister's future in-laws. You come, you smile, you say nothing about your job. No hello. No did I wake you. Just orders, the way she'd been giving them my whole life. I asked her why it mattered so much, why the warning, why now, and she exhaled like I was the exhausting one in this conversation. Her father-in-law is a federal judge, Erin. A real one. Appointed and everything. Don't you dare make this about you. I lay there in the dark for a long minute after we hung up, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles above me, wondering what exactly she thought I was capable of ruining. My younger sister Holly had been engaged for 4 months to a man named Trevor, whose father, Judge Marcus Calloway, was the kind of name my family said with a little extra air in their lungs, like saying it wrong might get them held in contempt. I'd met Trevor maybe 3 times. I'd met the judge 0 times. What I had heard repeatedly in the careful tones my mother reserved for people she wanted to impress was that he was distinguished, that he was respected, that he'd shaken hands with 2 governors, and that under absolutely no circumstances was I to bring up anything weird in front of him. I want to be clear about something before I go further, because it matters for what comes later. I wasn't the wild child. I wasn't the embarrassment because I'd done anything scandalous. I was the embarrassment because at 29 years old, I didn't have a husband, didn't have a house with a finished basement, and worked a job that nobody at our family gatherings had ever once asked a follow-up question about. Erin works in compliance. My mother would say to relatives, the same flat sentence every time, the same little shrug that suggested compliance was something you did instead of something you were proud of. Nobody ever asked compliance for what. I'd stopped expecting them to. The dinner was at the Calloway house, which sat on 3 acres outside the city with a circular driveway and a fountain that actually ran water even though it was October, and nobody was going to be sitting outside. I parked my Honda Civic between a Range Rover and something German I couldn't identify and sat there for a second. Smoothing the front of my dress, the navy one I always wore to things like this, because navy never drew attention, and attention was the one thing I'd been told my whole life not to draw. My mother was waiting at the door, like she'd been standing there for 20 minutes, just to make sure I didn't slip in unnoticed and unmanaged. She looped her arm through mine the second I crossed the threshold, the way you'd grip a kid's hand near a busy parking lot. Remember what we talked about, she murmured, steering me past the foyer, past a wall of family photos I didn't recognize anyone in. Smile, compliments only. If anyone asks about your work, you say it's administrative and you change the subject. I'd already decided, somewhere around the bridge on the drive over, that the smartest move for the evening was to be furniture. Smile, nod, eat chicken, leave by 9. Holly looked happier than I'd seen her look in years, glowing in a way that made me forget for a second all the noise around the evening and just feel glad for her. Trevor's mother hugged me like she meant it. Trevor himself made a joke about the seating chart that actually made me laugh. For about 40 minutes, I almost let myself relax. Then the toasts started. Judge Calloway stood at the head of the table in a dark suit that fit him the way suits only fit men who've never once in their adult lives had to think about the price of one. He had that voice, the kind that didn't need volume to fill a room, because everyone had already decided to stop talking the second he stood up. He talked about how proud he was of his son, how impressed he'd been getting to know Holly these past months, how marriage between 2 families was its own kind of verdict on both of them, and the table laughed at that. The easy laugh people give powerful men for jokes that aren't really that funny. Then his eyes moved, past Trevor, past Holly, past my mother's tight, hopeful smile, and landed on me. He stopped talking mid-sentence. Not a stumble, not a dramatic pause for effect. A full stop, the kind where you can feel 20 people shift in their chairs without understanding why yet. He set his wine glass down on the table, slow and deliberate, like he didn't trust his own hand to do it gently if he rushed, and he started walking toward my end of the table. My mother's fingers found my forearm under the table and dug in. Holly's smile faltered into confusion, her eyes bouncing between me and the judge, like she was trying to read a sentence in a language she only half spoke. I had absolutely no idea why a federal judge I had never met in my life was walking directly toward me with an expression I can only describe now looking back as recognition trying to place itself. "I'm sorry," he said, stopping in front of my chair, his voice quieter than it had been a moment ago but somehow carrying just as far. "I have to ask, have we met?" I told him no, I didn't think so, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, given that my pulse was doing something closer to a sprint. He tilted his head slightly, studying my face the way you study a word you almost remember the spelling of. "You look exactly like someone I should know the name of," he said. "And I don't like not knowing things. It's an occupational hazard." A few people laughed, nervous, unsure if this was a bit. It wasn't a bit. You could feel that it wasn't a bit. Then, slower, like he already suspected the answer was going to crack something open in that dining room that he hadn't planned on cracking open during a dinner party, he asked, "What is it you do exactly?" My son mentioned compliance, but I don't think that's the whole story. The room had gone quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when everyone suddenly remembers they're allowed to listen. My mother's mouth opened slightly. No words came out of it. I set my fork down because my hands, against all odds, were steadier than my heartbeat, and I looked the judge directly in the eye. "I'm Erin," I said. "Holly's older sister." It wasn't an answer to his actual question, and we both knew it. The corner of his mouth twitched, the look of a man enjoying a private joke he hadn't decided yet whether to share with the room. "Erin Whitlock," he said, and he said my full name slow, deliberate, the way you say a name you've read 100 times on documents, but never once said out loud to the person attached to it. "Senior Compliance Examiner, Federal Banking Division. You ran the audit on Maddox Regional 2 years ago." He let that sit there for a second, watching it land. "You're the reason that bank's executive team is currently sitting in a courtroom instead of running it into the ground a second time. I sat on the appeals panel for the case your findings built. I read your name in the brief probably 40 times before I ever knew what you looked like. You could have heard a dropped napkin 3 rooms away." My mother's hand actually did slide off the table edge, knocking her own napkin to the floor, and nobody moved to pick it up. I hadn't planned on this room ever knowing any of that. I'd left the kind of high-visibility regulatory work that puts your name in federal filings almost 3 years earlier, not because I was ashamed of it, but because explaining it to people who'd already decided who I was felt like trying to argue with a closed door. My mother liked her narrative tidy. The underachieving daughter, the one without a ring, the risk to be managed at family functions. It was a simpler story for her than the truth, which was that I'd spent 4 years pulling apart the financial guts of institutions that thought they were untouchable, that I'd had federal agents in my office more than once, that I'd testified behind closed doors in a case that ended with 3 executives losing their licenses. None of that fit on the little card my mother had written for me a long time ago, so she'd just never updated it. "You told me not to talk about my work tonight," I said, turning toward her, my voice calmer than I had any right to feel. Calm in that specific way you get when panic has simply run out of usefulness. So I didn't. Around the table, relatives who had spent the whole evening glancing past me like part of the centerpiece were now staring with the particular intensity of people doing rapid social math, recalculating exactly where the actual power in the room had been sitting the entire time. Holly's hand had drifted to her collarbone, her eyes moving between me and the judge, with something between confusion and a slow, dawning understanding. Trevor hadn't said a single word, but his expression had the look of a man watching 2 unrelated movies get spliced together by accident. The judge straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same easy authority from his toast, except now there was real weight under it. "I'll tell you something I don't say often," he said, looking around the table. Not unkindly, but without softening it either. "I don't embarrass easily. But I find it embarrassing, genuinely embarrassing, to watch a room undervalue someone who has done more good quietly than most people in this house will ever get the chance to do loudly." His eyes settled on my mother when he said it, not cruel. Just precise, the way men talk when they've spent 30 years being paid to be precise for a living. My mother opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She closed it again. For the first time in my entire life, I watched her run completely out of script. "Marcus," Trevor's mother said gently, a hand on the judge's arm, trying to steer the moment back toward dessert and small talk. He nodded, sat back down, picked his toast back up like nothing had happened, finished it with the same warmth he'd started with. But something in the room had shifted permanently, and everybody at that table knew it, even the ones pretending they didn't. Holly found me near the kitchen later, away from the noise, holding a glass of wine she clearly wasn't drinking anymore. She didn't lead with an apology. She just stood there for a second, looking at me like she was seeing a slightly different person than the one she'd grown up next to, and asked quietly why I'd never told her any of it. "There didn't seem to be room for it," I said. "The version of me everybody already agreed on didn't really leave space for the real one. She nodded slowly, the way people do when they're absorbing something they probably should have asked about years earlier, and then she said she was proud of me. I genuinely don't think either of us had ever said those words to each other and meant them before that night. My mother caught me by the coat closet on my way out, her composure stitched back together but visibly thinner now, like wallpaper patched in a hurry with the wrong pattern. She started in on how I should have told her, how she would have handled things differently if she'd known, how embarrassing it had been to find out like that in front of everyone. I just looked at her for a second, and something in me that had been bracing for this conversation for 15 years finally just let go. That's exactly the problem, I said. My worth to you has always depended on what I could offer to be seen with, never on just being your daughter. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told her good night, pulled my coat on, and walked out into air that was sharp and cold and felt, somehow, like the first real breath I'd taken in years. I sat in my car in that big circular driveway for a minute before I started the engine, watching the fountains still running pointlessly in the October dark, throwing light in every direction it didn't need to. I thought about all the dinners before this one, where I'd folded myself down small enough to fit into the shape my mother needed me to be. And I thought about how it had taken a stranger, a man I'd never met, looking at me across a dining room and refusing to look away, to say the thing my own family had never once managed to say to my face. I drove home with the windows cracked even though it was cold, because I wanted to feel something other than the inside of that house. And somewhere around the second red light I realized I was smiling, not the practice kind I'd worn all night, but a real one, the kind that comes from finally being seen exactly as you are, instead of who you'd quietly agreed, for far too long, to pretend to be.